Okay, welcome to Chapter 9, the endocrine system. The interesting thing about the endocrine system is in a small way, we've kind of talked a little bit about, well, maybe not necessarily about the endocrine system specifically, but a similar communication link or a way that the body communicates that is similar to the endocrine system. The way I want you to think about the endocrine system is it is a system that is designed for the body to communicate with itself or with other organs or other parts of the body internally without using the nervous system. A couple of chapters back we talked about the nervous system and how it communicates with the body and causes different muscles or organs to do different things. And typically the nervous system has a lot to do more with muscle side of things, but it does actually innervate some organs and things such as that too. But a part of that nervous system is it had those neurotransmitters. Remember those chemical messengers that would communicate between the nerve ending and the tissue or between two nerves? Well, the endocrine system is a lot like that, only it has messengers, chemical messengers, that may be able to communicate from one side of the body to the other side of the body. So it's a much bigger gap. Instead of that little gap in between a target organ and the nerve, or between two nerves, a really small microscopic gap that is communicating with that neurotransmitter. The endocrine system uses, hormones and different chemical messengers to transmit a message or to cause an organ or to stimulate or to start or stop some process using a chemical that it sends out either through the bloodstream or by other means. So it is a messenger system that triggers things to go on within the body, and that's basically what the endocrine system does. Now we're going to talk about the endocrine system. We're going to talk about the different components of that, and we're even going to talk about some of the chemical messengers that are present there. But we're not going to get real in depth into how each one of them are created or all of them that exist, so we're just going to kind of talk about some of the higher points of the endocrine system and some of those chemical messengers, just so you have a good basis understanding of what some of those systems do. But by no means are we going to talk about all of them that are all of these chemical messengers that are present. We're going to talk about kind of the big hitters, the main ones. So because the endocrine system and its similarity to the nervous system, it's considered the secondary controlling system of the body. The nervous system is the fastest because of the way that it transmits its impulses and does those types of things. This is the secondary one because it's slower. It uses those chemical messengers, and we call them hormones, that are released into the blood to cause other organs or other body systems to do certain things based upon the hormone that's released. So these hormones have several major processes. They control several major processes, such as reproduction, growth, development, body defenses, maintenance of a lot of our homeostasis that goes on, and as well as the regulation of our metabolism. So these hormones are responsible for a lot of things. And I'm certain that, by this point in your life, you've heard of somebody somewhere along the lines that has had some kind of hormonal issue, whether it was a friend, family member, an acquaintance, or you've seen it on TV, that had some sort of hormonal issue. You just didn't realize what it was that they were talking about. And when we get to some of those areas, you might start to recognize, hey, I've heard of that before, because it is a very vital system. It seems relatively unimportant, but it is actually critically important to our survival. So these hormones that I've been talking about are produced by specialized cells in the body. Specialized cells produce these hormones. They secrete these hormones into extracellular fluids, and then the blood transfers those hormones to the target tissues or to the sites that it needs to stimulate. What these hormones do is they regulate the activity of other cells, either to turn them on or to turn them off. So you got a cell that does a specific thing, and these hormones either turn that activity of that cell on or turn it off. And endocrinology is a specialty There are physicians that are endocrinologists, so they go to medical school for that. You know, we want to think that it's 8 years of their life, but it's probably more like 10. And then they go to a specialty, so which is another couple of years on top of that, and they become an endocrinologist. So 12 or 14 years of their life has been dedicated to their specialty that they do, kind of like a cardiologist. We have an endocrinologist that specializes in this area. And they specialize in the study of hormones and those particular organs that produce those hormones called endocrine organs. And that's their specialty, that's their niche. The classifications of hormones, they're classified either as amino acid based, such as your proteins, peptides, and amines. They're either steroids that are made from cholesterol or prostaglandins that are highly active lipids. So, though they're called hormones, they're kind of classified differently as amino acid, steroids, prostaglandins. Now, we've probably heard of steroids before, maybe even some amino acids, but oftentimes we don't think of these as hormones in that respect. So you should start thinking of them that way. These hormones only affect certain tissues or organs, their particular target organs or target cells. They must have the right protein receptor on that cell in order for them to interact with that particular hormone. What will happen is this hormone will bind to that cell or to those protein receptors and trigger that cell's activity, trigger that cell to kick in and start to do whatever it is that it's supposed to do. So they arouse these cells, and they maybe even alter the cellular activity. Maybe a cell's doing a certain thing and it's what that cell always does. But this hormone comes along and tells it, wait, don't do that, do this, or slow down doing this, or speed up doing that. It changes what it does, or it alters its activity. We usually get one of these types of things, one of these 5 things that's going to happen. It may change the permeability of the membrane. It may cause it to synthesize proteins and create enzymes. It may activate or inactivate enzymes. It may stimulate cell division, or it may cause that particular cell to begin secreting something, whatever it produces. It's going to depend on the cell. It's going to depend on the hormone. It's going to depend on a variety of factors, but that's what they do. These hormones act by 2 mechanisms. Either they directly activate a gene, or they are part of a secondary messenger system. So either they're going to have a direct impact, or they're kind of starting, they're kind of kicking things off. They're a secondary messenger. They're kind of coming in and going, hey, go tell that guy to do that. And that's kind of by the mechanisms by which they work. The direct gene-activated process, the way that works, steroid hormones diffuse through the plasma membrane of the target cells. They enter the nucleus, bind to a protein in the nucleus, and then there's specific sites on the cell's DNA, and these are the activation results in a synthesis of new proteins. So this particular process, the direct gene activation process, is where synthesis of new proteins occur. And here's just an example of that. We have that hormone. We have a receptor protein. It goes in there, it binds, causes a triggering of creating a new protein. Messenger RNA is created because of that, and then ultimately a new protein is created. So that's really just a very simplistic way to look at how that process happens. But that's one of the 2. The second way the second thing that happens with it is nonsteroid hormone action, or the second messenger. Basically, what happens is the hormone binds to a membrane. The receptor sites, the activated sites, set off a series of reactions that activates an enzyme. The enzyme then reacts to produce a second messenger molecule, and it gives AMP or CAMP. And that oversees additional intracellular changes to promote specific response in the cell. So the second one actually just stimulates something that on the surface of the cell rather than actually going inside of the cell. This one stimulates the surface of the cell to cause something, a chain reaction to kind of occur internally in the cell for the ultimate whatever that cell is going to do to happen. So we see that here, triggers it, causes the chain to kind of be set in motion, and that's what happens. Now, in order for the body to maintain itself and to be able to function normally, there's got to be some control over how these hormones are released. They can't be just randomly released. There's got to be control. Most of the time, the control over this is done through the negative feedback mechanism that we talked about several chapters back, I think probably in the first or second chapter. Sometimes a stimulus or a low hormone level in the blood can trigger the release of a hormone, and then that release is going to stop once the appropriate level in the blood is reached. So some of these hormone levels are maintained. I would say probably the vast majority of these are maintained. There's a certain level that's maintained in the blood. Different things will cause a level to drop, either intentionally. The body may, voluntarily say, hey, we need to reduce the amount of this hormone because this is what's going on in the body. Or we may need to increase the amount of this hormone because this is what's going on in the body. This hormonal release is, like I say, it's that negative feedback system that's kind of helping the body decide what needs to go on. There's several factors that come into play. Some of this happens within the brain, and then what's kind of funny is sometimes we have hormone releases that trigger hormone releases that trigger something else to happen in the body with a different target organ. It's an interesting process that goes on. So the endocrine gland is stimulated. This is the stimulation that activates an endocrine gland falls into three major categories. So what causes an activation of an endocrine gland is either hormonal, humoral, or neural. So one of these three pathways is what's going to cause the release or the stimulation of an endocrine gland to release hormones. The hormonal release is the most common. These organs are activated by other hormones. Like I said, it's kind of an odd thing, but the example that it gives is the anterior pituitary hormone travels to the target gland, such as the thyroid, to prompt the release of a particular hormone, such as the thyroid hormone. So this anterior pituitary, remember the anterior pituitary is actually located in the brain, so this is the brain controlling the release of the pituitary hormone to cause the release of a thyroid hormone. So it's kind of a cascade effect, but there's still control over it, but it's the most common way, and this is just one example of that. Please don't think that that's the only one that does that. There's several others, multiple examples. The humoral has to do with blood levels of certain ions and nutrients that stimulate hormone release. By taking a sampling of various body fluids such as blood and bile, that kind of thing will cause either the release or the holding back of different hormones. This gives an example of parathyroid hormone and calcitonin are produced by changing levels of blood calcium levels. So calcitonin, remember, is that substance that causes us to either store or remove calcium in our bones. So if we don't have enough blood calcium levels, it's going to affect the amount of calcitonin that's produced. It's going to tell our body to either store or release calcium from the bones. Insulin is produced in response to changing levels of blood glucose. After we eat a big meal and our blood glucose levels rise, it triggers the release of insulin, so that we can utilize that blood glucose and we can get the blood glucose levels back down to normal. And it's just an example of that. Humoral, that's the humoral way. Neural stimulation is done by nerve impulses. So we have a nerve impulse that stimulates a hormone release. Most of these are under the control of the sympathetic nervous system. We talked about that. So it's usually when we get that kind of that fight or flight kind of thing. And the example that it gives us is the norepinephrine and epinephrine that's released by the adrenal medulla that's set on top of the kidneys. We haven't talked a lot about the adrenal medulla. We're going to talk about it today. But those set right on top of the kidneys, and those are under the direct control of the sympathetic nervous system. The interesting thing about the sympathetic nervous system, Neural impulses, whenever we have a neural impulse such as fight or flight, somebody jumps out from around the corner at us and, scares the water out of us. We jump, the reaction is very quick. But the body sometimes needs to sustain that heightened emotion or that heightened awareness state. And the nervous system can't do that. So what it does is that stimulation or that excitement of somebody doing that to you causes a stimulation of the adrenal medulla, or the adrenal glands on top of the kidneys, and they release epi and norepi into the bloodstream that makes that excited state last longer. So the initial excited state by the nervous system is very short-lived, and the prolonging of that is done by the release of norepinephrine and epinephrine into the bloodstream by the adrenal medulla that's located on top of the kidneys, that is actually stimulated by that same sympathetic nervous system that caused you to, lose your water. Which actually, it's kind of funny, we say that somebody scares the water out of us, but really it doesn't happen that way. Stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system actually causes you not to lose your water, typically. But it can. You still can. So, major endocrine glands: the pituitary, thyroid, parathyroid, adrenals, like we just talked about. Pineal, and the pineal gland is not the gland you're thinking of. Thymus, pancreas, gonads, and hypothalamus. We'll talk about each one of these into varying degrees or varying depths. And really, I'm not going to ask you what necessarily, there might be a couple of these, but for the most part, I'm not going to ask you what hormone is released by each one of these. There might be some generalities that you should be able to connect the dots on once you've studied through this chapter, but I'm not going to ask you exactly which hormones are released by what. Here's the location of all those endocrine glands. Let's see. Some glands are purely endocrine, meaning such as the anterior pituitary, thyroid, adrenals, and parathyroids. These endocrine glands are ductless glands, and these hormones that they produce are released directly into the bloodstream or the lymphatic vessels, the lymphatic system. We'll talk about the lymphatic system a little bit later, but the hormones that they produce, pure endocrine glands, actually just kind of secrete those things into the blood or the lymph that surrounds them. The rest of the glands are mixed. They have both endocrine and exocrine functions, the pancreas and the gonads, meaning that they actually excrete their things externally, out on the outside. So endocrine means inside, exocrine means outside. Exocrine functions, the pancreas, what it does is it excretes things into the digestive system. And remember, I kind of told you that the digestive system is actually external to the body, and that's why it's an exocrine gland, because it's excreting into the digestive tract. And it's excreting things to help break things down, is what it's doing. Gonads are reproductive organs. Without getting into too great of a detail, obviously a lot of what it does is actually doing things or excreting things that are external to the body and not internal. Blood and lymph is actually internal. It's inside of the body. Other places it's external. Okay, so the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus is the first one of these glands that we're going to talk about. Pituitary is about the size of a pea. It hangs by a stalk from the hypothalamus in the brain, and is protected by the sphenoid bone of the skull. Two functional lobes. It has the anterior and the posterior, often called the master endocrine gland. And you can think of that as it's kind of the controlling gland for other glands, what they do. And the hypothalamus produces releasing and inhibiting hormones. Also makes two hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Both of those are important enough that we want to talk about them. Oxytocin actually stimulates contraction of the uterus during labor, and also can cause milk ejection in a breastfeeding woman. That's not necessarily the one that causes the production of milk, but it can cause the ejection of milk. So oxytocin plays an important role in, with childbearing women and post-childbearing, and still breastfeeding women. Antidiuretic hormone actually inhibits the production of urine. In larger amounts, it causes vasoconstriction of arterioles, leading to higher blood pressures and that kind of thing. Alcohol actually inhibits the antidiuretic secretion. So whenever you drink alcohol, even if your body is dehydrated and your body is actually releasing the antidiuretic hormone, because that's what it'll do. If you're a little dehydrated, it'll release the antidiuretic hormone and tell your kidneys to hold on to more water. But if you drink alcohol, it will cause your body, it will actually override the antidiuretic hormone, and your kidneys will release more water instead of holding on to more. This is why this is why alcohol oftentimes leads to a hangover the next day. Hangover is typically associated with being acutely dehydrated. A lot of the symptoms of a hangover because of acute dehydration. And alcohol plays a major role in that. Also, diabetes can result from a low secrete, or diabetes insipidus can result from a low amount of antidiuretic hormone secretion, which we won't get real deep into that. But diabetes insipidus has to do with having too much fluid and how the problems that it causes. There's 6 hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary gland. Remember, the pituitary gland is broken up into 2 sides, anterior and posterior. Now we're talking about the front. 2 of them affect growth. There's the growth hormone and prolactin. And the other 4 are thyroid stimulating hormones, the adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicular stimulating hormone, and the luteinizing hormones. The characteristics of these particular hormones is they kind of have a protein structure. They act through the secondary messenger system that we talked about earlier, but they're regulated by hormonal stimuli and negative feedback. So we can see the hormone that we're talking about, and we're talking about the left side of that, the anterior pituitary, and the things that the hormones that it actually affects. Those hormones, remember these 6 hormones, there's 4 there, 2 there, the growth hormone, prolactin, thyroid stimulating adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicular stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. That's what we're going to talk about right here. The growth hormone is a general metabolic hormone. Its major effects are directed toward the growth of the skeletal muscles and long bones. It plays a major role in determining what the final body size of us as a person is going to be. And what I mean by final body size, I'm not talking about, obesity or anything like that. That's a different hormone. I'm talking about how big your skeleton is going to be and the size of your muscles. I'm fairly tall, not really, I'm probably averagely tall, but I got ripped off when it come to muscles. I just don't have a lot of muscle mass like some of these other guys do. It's just genetically the way that my family is made. We're all underneath all of our fat cells, we're all pretty slender builds. Not a whole lot of muscle there. This also causes the amino acids to be built into proteins and causes fats to be broken down for a source of energy. My growth hormone seems to not work at all because I don't break down much fat. I just keep it all. Also, some disorders that can be caused by this growth hormone. One of them is dwarfism, is one of them that can be caused by that. And of course, gigantism is another one. Acromegaly results in a hypersecretion of the growth hormone during adulthood, or acromegaly. So we can see an example of that here. Can you imagine? I would imagine both of these people here feel, kind of a little ripped off. You would think, yeah, I would much rather be the tall guy than the short guy. I don't know, he probably has a host of medical problems and things in his life just weren't all that easy. Can you imagine what it's like trying to buy clothes when you're 8'1"? You're just not going to go to you're not going to go to Kmart or Walmart or even, Dillard's or anywhere like that and find clothes that's going to fit you. I mean, where are you going to find shoes? You're going to have to go to a boat maker to find shoes. So life's going to be difficult for both of them. Okay? One of the other hormones is prolactin. It stimulates and maintains milk production following childbirth. Actually, it does occur in males, but what it does for males is pretty much unknown. And then there's the adrenocorticotropic hormone, which regulates endocrine activity in the adrenal cortex. So it's kind of an internal regulatory hormone. The thyrotropic hormone, also called the thyroid stimulating hormone, it influences growth and activity of the thyroid gland. So there's some influence there. The gonadotropic hormones, they regulate, there's two of them here. The follicle stimulating hormone, it actually stimulates follicle development in the ovaries and sperm production in the testes. And then there's the luteinizing hormone that triggers ovulation in females and stimulates testosterone production in males. So it's interesting that we have both male and female both have these hormones, but how they affect the male and female bodies is different. Obviously because we have different parts, but it's interesting that it's the same hormones that can cause the reaction. So it's not a different hormone in males and females. It's both the same hormones. Okay? All right. Remember, I'm not going to test you on those specific hormones. If there is a question about a hormone or that asks you about a specific hormone, it's only because I think it's common enough that you probably should know that, and it should jump out at you, and you hopefully wouldn't have any trouble with it. So don't kill yourself trying to understand those completely, but it's a good idea to at least be familiar with them and try to have some basis for understanding of them. I don't want you to completely discount them and not think they're important at all. The thyroid gland is found at the base of the throat, has two lobes, produces two hormones. It's thyroid hormone and calcitonin. And we see a picture of it here. We can see right there where it's located. Thyroid hormone is a metabolic hormone. Pretty easy to remember where that hormone comes from. Thyroid gland, thyroid hormone. Not a lot of difficulty there. It controls the rate of oxidation of glucose to supply supply body heat and chemical energy. It's also needed for tissue growth, and it's composed of two active iodine-containing hormones. And this is where iodine becomes important, because iodine is important to the proper function of the thyroid gland. And we can see where the iodine comes into play there. One of the conditions or one of the disorders of the thyroid gland is what's called goiters. And it enlarges, the thyroid gland will begin to enlarge because of a lack of iodine. That's why in modern society, all of our salt is iodized. So if you look at your salt container, your deal of salt that you buy in the grocery store, it says it's iodized. But you know what salt is not iodized? If you buy sea salt and you only use sea salt in your diet, you're going to begin to have a problem. Because a lot of the sea salt out there is not iodized. At least it hasn't traditionally been. But our salt in our modern society is iodized to help ensure that we have we ingest enough iodine in our diets. Cretinism is caused by hyposecretion of thyroxide, and it results in dwarfism during childhood. So that's one of those. We can see a big goiter there. She probably lives in a third world country, has limited or very little access to iodized or iodine supplements. Usually treatment with iodine over the course of time will begin to reduce that, and it'll be less of a problem. Myxedema is caused by hypothyroid in adults and causes physical and mental sluggishness. So a slow working thyroid is going to cause some physical and mental sluggishness. And then there's Graves' disease, which is hyperthyroidism, increased metabolism, heat tolerance, rapid heartbeat, weight loss, and other issues is commonly associated with Graves' disease and the thyroid. The calcitonin is the other hormone that's released by the thyroid gland, and its job is to decrease blood calcium levels by causing calcium to be deposited in bone. It's produced by the parafollicular cells found between the follicles of the thyroid gland. So, and if we have a larger amount of calcitonin in the blood, that means that we probably have a high calcium blood level. And the fix for a high calcium blood level is to cause more calcium to be stored in bone, and that's what calcitonin does. Actually stimulates the storage of calcium in the bone. Parathyroid glands are tiny masses on the posterior on the back side of the thyroid. They secrete the parathyroid hormone, and what this does is it stimulates osteoclasts to remove calcium from the bone. So when our calcium levels drop, we're going to have a release of the parathyroid hormone that's going to cause those osteoclasts to start freeing up calcium into the blood supply. It also is going to cause the kidneys and the intestines to absorb more calcium because the blood levels of calcium is too low. Adrenal glands, talked about these briefly. We'll talk about them a little bit more. They sit on top of the kidneys. There's two parts of the adrenal gland. They have the cortex and the medulla. The cortex is the outer region, and there's 3 layers of that. And the adrenal is the inner tissue or the inner region of that gland. So, let's see. What's produced here in the adrenal cortex, and remember the adrenal cortex is the outer layer, is mainly mineralocorticoids. Basically, they regulate the mineral content of the blood, particularly sodium and potassium levels. They also, because they're dealing with the mineral content, they also can regulate water and electrolyte balances. And their target organ is the kidney. It's convenient because they sit right on top of the kidney. But remember, we're talking about the adrenal cortex. We're talking about the outer region of that particular gland. Okay? And that's what it does. It maintains mineral content. It also releases some aldosterone, such as a release of aldosterone that is stimulated by some humoral factors. And there's this renin-angiotensin 2 in response to a drop in blood pressure. This aldosterone is actually going to affect blood pressure and other things. Mainly, it has an effect on blood pressure because of the angiotensin effects. It's going to increase the blood pressure. Is what aldosterone is going to do. It's going to be in response usually to a drop in blood pressure. It's also it can be inhibited by this atrial nucleic peptide, which is produced in the heart. So the heart can actually neutralize that aldosterone that's being released. So sometimes we get it's part of that body trying to maintain that balance. So it's just a couple of hormones that are produced, or a hormone that's produced in the adrenal cortex, and then this atrial nucleic peptide is the one that's produced in the heart. I know I'm not going to ask you that on the test because I seen that question and I opted not to ask you that because I thought it'd be mean. So I didn't ask you that one about which hormones produced in the heart. Okay. Also, there's glucocorticoids, cortisone and cortisol that's produced in that cortex. Remember, we're still talking about the outer part of that adrenal. This is a little bit further in that cortex. And what cortisol does and cortisone is it stimulates normal cell metabolism. There's some diet drugs out there and all that kind of stuff that talk about, stimulating cortisol release or that contain cortisol to help speed up metabolism and all that kind of stuff. Cortisol is actually kind of associated with stress. So it actually, having enough cortisol can help you resist long-term stressors that cause increased blood glucose levels. Also has these glucocorticoids have some anti-inflammatory properties. It's in response to an increase of blood levels of ACTH. So don't sweat what that is. All right. Also in that adrenal cortex, there's a lot going on in the adrenal cortex. There's some sex hormones produced there. And those are on the inner layer in small amounts, and they're made throughout life. Mostly they're androgens, male sex hormones are made, but some estrogens or female hormones are formed there too. And these are just small amounts that are made throughout our life that are released, in whatever quantities that they're released in. And that's in that cortex. There are some disorders associated with the adrenal cortex. Addison's disease is one of them. Hyposecretion of some of the hormones of the adrenal cortex. Bronze-colored skin, muscle weakness, burnout, susceptibility to infection. Hyperaldosteronism. Usually we'll see excess water and sodium is retained. High blood pressure and edema. Cushing's syndrome, they kind of have that moon face or that buffalo hump on their back. High blood pressure, hyperglycemia, weakening of bones, depression, those types of things. Masculinization results from hypersecretion of sex hormones. Beard and male distribution of hair growth is where that can take place. So sometimes we see females growing, starting to kind of have some more male traits that can be associated with the adrenal cortex. Okay, the adrenal medulla, the inner part of the adrenal gland, the center part of that. Two hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. These are those fight or flight hormones that I talked about earlier that are a response to the sympathetic nervous system stimulation. Increases heart rate, blood pressure, glucose levels. It dilates the small passageways of the lungs. Does those things, probably even causes a little vasoconstriction and a raise in the blood pressure. So if we look at this gland over here on the left, you can see the adrenal gland, and you can see the medulla and the cortex. Those are the two layers that we're talking about. The epi and norepi are released in the medulla, in that center part of that. A little more vascular axis, because that's where it's going, is directly into the bloodstream. Okay? All right, moving on. Other endocrine glands, actually the next one is the endocrine exocrine gland. It actually does both, is the pancreas. It's located in the middle of the abdomen, close to the stomach. Has both endocrine and exocrine functions. And it has these islets in there that produce hormones. These islets are important because they produce insulin and glucagon. These islets are actually called the islets of Langerhans. It's, I guess, the name of the doctor that found them. Sometimes on some tests, you might see a question about that you won't see it on any of the tests in this anatomy class, but on some of your tests, maybe you go into nursing or paramedic school or something like that, you might see those islets actually referred to as a question that has the islets of Langerhans, is asking where insulin and glucagon are produced. And actually, those islets only make up about 1% of the total volume of the pancreas. So it's a very, very small percentage of the pancreas that actually produce insulin and glucagon in the islets. And these hormones basically help maintain the blood sugar levels, the balance of the blood sugar levels. Insulin is actually required for glucose to enter the cells. Without insulin, glucose can't enter the cells. It is a hormone that is required in order to facilitate glucose entering the cells. So, and you know, that will probably be discussed a little bit more in depth later, but that's what insulin does. So in a diabetic that doesn't produce enough insulin, what happens is they have an abundance of glucose. They just can't utilize that glucose. The cells can't utilize the glucose. And the fix for that is either if they're a type 1 diabetic, then we're going to have to give them insulin. They're going to have to take insulin shots. Type 1 is a juvenile onset diabetes. And what's happened there is their islets, at some point in time in their youth as a juvenile, their islets just stop working. They stop producing insulin and glucagon. So they're no longer able to facilitate the use of glucose in their body, and the glucose levels rise, and their cells don't get enough glucose. You know, if you remember back when we were talking about the Krebs cycle, a key ingredient in the Krebs cycle is glucose. So if the cells can't get glucose because they don't have enough insulin, then the cells are not going to produce ATP, and they're going to begin to die. We see that primarily, we really see it start to happen in the brain. If they don't produce enough glucose, then we're going to have or if they don't produce enough insulin, then they're not going to be able to use the glucose. Type 2 diabetics, sometimes they can give them a medication that stimulates the release, tells their pancreas to release more insulin. And sometimes that works. It depends on how far progressed the disease process is. And if that's the case, as that process gets more progressive, sometimes they wind up on insulin as well. The good news is they've done a lot of research in this area, at least for those type 1 diabetics, the juvenile onset diabetics. They're getting closer and closer and closer to a cure with them. The type 2 diabetics, there's really haven't made as much progress with them as they have with the type 1s. I really think that in our lifetime we will see a cure for type 1 diabetics. I'm not sure about type 2 though. Type 2 is a little bit tougher. There's just a little example of the pancreatic islets, the islets of Langerhans. They make up, like I say, a very small percentage, 1% of the overall production or the overall mass of the pancreas. So insulin is released when the blood sugar levels are high, when the blood glucose levels are high. Glucagon is released when the blood glucose levels are low, but what glucagon does, it actually stimulates the liver to release glucose into the blood and increase the blood glucose level. So if we've got somebody with a low blood glucose level, glucagon is the fix. But if we have a type 1 diabetic and they've taken too much insulin and used up all their glucose in their body, because of their condition, they actually don't produce enough glucagon either, because their islets don't work properly. So they're not able to recover from having too much insulin as readily as a normal functioning pancreas would. So also it's not completely unheard of to have somebody have a blood sugar drop and really not be a diabetic or not be a diagnosed diabetic. There can be some blood sugar issues that are kind of related to diet and those kinds of things. As we age, sometimes those things can get a little out of whack, and it's not a long-term issue, it's just a little short-term incident. Okay? Here's a little video about, if it'll let us play it. Maybe if I quit touching it, will it?
The sugary snack you devour enters your digestive system and is broken down to simple sugars like glucose. Glucose enters the bloodstream, causing an increase in blood glucose levels. But various mechanisms bring blood glucose back down to its normal level, the set point. This is an example of homeostasis, the body's tendency to maintain relatively constant internal conditions. Hormones produced by the pancreas regulate blood glucose levels. Let's zoom in. When blood glucose levels are high, glucose molecules leave the blood and enter beta cells in the pancreas. The beta cells respond by releasing the hormone insulin. Insulin enters the bloodstream and is transported to cells all over the body. Let's see what happens in the liver. Insulin binds to receptors on liver cells. This causes the cells to take in more glucose. Inside the liver cells, glucose is converted to glycogen, a storage molecule. Blood glucose levels decrease as glucose is taken up by liver cells and other body cells. As a result, less and less insulin is released by the pancreas, and blood glucose levels stabilize at their set point. This is an example of how negative feedback maintains homeostasis. What happens if you've skipped lunch and your blood glucose levels are low? Let's zoom into the pancreas again. When blood glucose levels are low, alpha cells in the pancreas release the hormone glucagon. Glucagon enters the bloodstream and acts on target cells in the liver. Glucagon binds to receptors on the liver cells, signaling the liver cells to break glycogen down to glucose. Glucose is released. And blood glucose levels increase. As a result, less glucagon is released by the pancreas, and blood glucose levels stabilize at their set point. In this way, two hormones with opposing effects allow the body to maintain homeostasis of blood glucose levels. In diabetes, the body is unable to maintain homeostasis of blood glucose levels. In type 1 diabetes, the beta cells of the pancreas are destroyed by the immune system, and so no insulin is produced. In type 2 diabetes, the pancreas produces insulin, but target cells do not take up glucose. In both types of diabetes, when blood glucose levels rise, cells do not take up the additional glucose, and so blood glucose remains high. This example shows the importance of homeostasis in everyone's life.
Okay, so hopefully that helped kind of clear that up a little bit if I confused you a little bit. Hopefully that's a little bit clearer kind of how that whole process works. What we call diabetes is diabetes mellitus has to do with the absence of insulin, and the blood sugars increase dramatically. Blood glucose some of that blood glucose is lost in urine, but the water follows that glucose when we lose it. It's one of the indications that somebody is a diabetic is they have ravenous thirst and they're going to the bathroom all the time because their body's trying to balance out that glucose. It's trying to rid itself of that excess glucose because it's not storing it like it should because of the lack of insulin. So whatever excess glucose there is, it can't get rid of it or it can't deal with it. So that's the three cardinal signs: polyuria, frequent urine, polydyspnea, and frequent thirst are the two main things that we're going to see with diabetes. Okay. All right. The pineal gland is located posterior to the third ventricle in the brain, and it secretes melatonin. This helps the body establish the sleep-wake cycles as the biological rhythms called the circadian rhythms. Believed to coordinate the hormone and fertility in humans as well. What's interesting is you can buy melatonin over the counter. and use it as a sleep aid. It's for most people, it's quite effective as a sleep aid. The great thing about it is there's no long lingering effects of it or anything like that. Basically, it just kind of helps your body go to sleep, unwind and go to sleep. But melatonin is actually produced in the pineal gland in that particular organ. Thymus gland is located posterior to the sternum, right behind your breastbone. It's largest in infants and children, and it produces thymosin, which causes some types of white blood cells to mature, and it's an important part of the developing immune system when we're younger. As we get older, that thymus gland begins to shrink, and it begins to do less and less and less as we reach maturity. And as adults, it's really not doing a whole lot. Gonads, ovaries, and testes. Ovaries obviously produce eggs, and they also have two steroidal hormones associated with them, estrogen and progesterone. The testes, on the other hand, produce sperm, and they have androgens such as testosterone that is produced. Now, I know we typically associate these particular hormones with either men or women, but realize that there's, like with testosterone, there's a small amount of testosterone in women as well. I'm not sure about estrogen and progesterone, but there could be small amounts of that produced in men. I'm not certain about that. But don't think that they're only produced in one side. It's just that they're produced in more amounts, larger amounts in one than the other. Estrogens stimulate the development of secondary female characteristics, and they cause female reproductive organs to mature. With progesterone, when we combine progesterone with estrogen, it promotes breast development and regulation of the menstrual cycle. Progesterone acts with estrogen to bring about the menstrual cycle and helps the implantation of the embryo in the uterus, helps prepare for breastfeeding. Hormones of the testes. There are several androgens that are produced, and testosterone is the most important of those, and probably the one we're most familiar with. Responsible for the adult male secondary sex characteristics. It promotes growth maturation of the male reproductive system, and it is required for sperm cell production. So it's something that we're probably all very familiar with. It's something now that, much like the estrogen and progesterone, that they're checking levels with, and now they're checking testosterone levels in men and kind of monkeying around with those. I don't know myself, the jury's still out. For years, we messed with estrogen and progesterone for women that had went through menopause and helping them deal with the issues that they were dealing with, and then actually found out that there were some bad things that kind of go along with that, and they've kind of scaled back actually treating those things or making the body produce more or adding to them. So I worry that maybe testosterone may have some similar effects in men that we just don't know about yet, but regardless, they are doing testosterone replacement therapy for men. There are some other hormone-producing tissues in the body. Some parts of the small intestine, parts of the stomach. Kidneys do some work. Remember I told you the heart, the atrial, whatever you call it, thing in there that produces that hormone. And there are a lot of other areas throughout the body that have some endocrine cells associated with them that do some of that stuff. The placenta is one of those. Excuse me, it produces hormones that maintain pregnancy. Some of those play a part in the delivery. And there's the gonadotropin in the addition of estrogen and progesterone and other hormones that are produced there in the placenta. As we grow, there are some things about the endocrine system we need to know about how that develops. In the absence of disease, the endocrine system usually maintains what it does what it does well into our old age. Typically, there's not major problems with the endocrine system, like we can see with some of the other body systems. Absent any particular disease with it, it works fine. Aside from in women, we start to see some decreasing function in the ovaries at menopause that can cause some symptoms such as osteoporosis, maybe some chances of heart disease and possible mood changes and those kinds of things. Those are things that are very big concerns, but remember, one stop the hormone replacement therapy for women that were going through menopause was the once thought as the big lifesaver. Sometimes it actually caused more issues, and I think they found maybe it's a little bit better to kind of deal with these individual things a little bit more one-on-one rather than just kind of throwing a bunch of hormones at it to try to tell the body what to do. The efficiency of the organs will gradually begin to decrease with age, which can cause some increased incidence of some various things. Doesn't mean that it will, it just means that it can. Maybe some diabetes, maybe some immune system problems, lower metabolic rate, cancer rates in some cases, sometimes changes. Doesn't mean that that will happen, just means that it's a possibility. And that is chapter 9. Hopefully it's not too confusing. It's a pretty straightforward chapter. And I will see you guys in chapter 10.